There are some love stories the world remembers, not because they were ordinary, but because they looked almost too perfect to be real. A beautiful Hollywood actress meets a handsome European prince. They fall in love. She leaves behind the world of movies, crosses the ocean, marries into royalty, and becomes a princess. It sounds like the ending of a fairy tale. But what if the fairy tale was only the beginning? What if behind the diamonds, palaces, photographs, royal ceremonies, and elegant gowns was a woman who had to give up almost everything that had made her independent? And what if the most romantic part of Grace Kelly's story was also the part that concealed the greatest sacrifice? Today, we are going beyond the famous photographs and the Hollywood legend to look at the complicated reality of Grace Kelly's royal marriage. Because Grace Kelly was not simply a movie star who became a princess. She was a woman who entered a completely different world under enormous expectations and discovered that becoming a princess did not mean she could continue living like Grace Kelly. Before she became Princess of Monaco, Grace Kelly had already achieved something extraordinary. She had conquered Hollywood. Born in Philadelphia in 1929 into a wealthy and ambitious family, Grace grew up surrounded by expectations. Her father, John B. Kelly Sr., was a successful businessman and Olympic rowing champion. Her family valued discipline, achievement, and reputation. Grace was not raised to simply be famous. She was raised to succeed, and eventually she did. In the early 1950s, Hollywood discovered her. She had something filmmakers could not easily manufacture, elegance that appeared effortless. Grace did not need to shout for attention. She could simply walk into a room, look at someone, and make the entire scene feel different. Her performances in films such as High Noon, Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, and The Country Girl transformed her from a promising actress into one of Hollywood's most recognizable stars. She worked with some of the greatest directors of the era, including Alfred Hitchcock, who became particularly fascinated by her screen presence. Hitchcock famously saw in Grace a combination of beauty, intelligence, mystery, and restraint. She could appear innocent without seeming naive. She could appear sophisticated without looking cold. And she could play a woman who seemed completely in control while suggesting that there was always something hidden underneath. That image would later become deeply connected with the way the world viewed Princess Grace. But there was a major difference. In Hollywood, Grace was playing characters. In Monaco, she had to become one, and that distinction changed everything. In 1955, Grace Kelly traveled to the French Riviera for the Cannes Film Festival. She was already a major American film star. Prince Rainier III of Monaco was already one of Europe's most famous bachelors. Their meeting has been retold so many times that it almost sounds like a scene written by a Hollywood screenwriter. The American actress, the European prince, the Mediterranean setting, the palace, the romance. But real life is rarely as simple as the photographs suggest. Grace and Rainier were introduced during the festival and spent time together. Their correspondence continued after she returned to the United States. Within months, the relationship moved very quickly. In January 1956, their engagement was announced, and suddenly, Grace Kelly was no longer just an actress. She was the future Princess of Monaco. The public was fascinated. Newspapers and magazines treated the relationship as one of the greatest romantic stories of the decade. For millions of people, it appeared that Grace had achieved the ultimate fantasy. She had already conquered Hollywood. Now she was marrying a prince. But there was something the fantasy did not emphasize. Grace wasn't simply marrying Rainier. She was entering a political institution, a royal household, a tiny sovereign state, and a society governed by traditions that were very different from Hollywood, and she was expected to adapt quickly. The wedding took place in April 1956. There were actually two ceremonies. A civil ceremony took place on April 18, followed by the religious wedding on April 19. The images from the wedding became legendary. Grace wore a wedding dress created by Helen Rose, the celebrated costume designer at MGM. The dress was elegant, structured, modest, and instantly recognizable. When people think of Grace Kelly today, many still picture that wedding gown. It became one of the most famous bridal dresses in modern history. The ceremony seemed perfect. The actress became a princess. The world celebrated. But immediately after the wedding, Grace entered a reality that was far less glamorous. Her professional life was essentially over. Grace Kelly was only 26 years old when she married Rainier. She had been at the height of her career. She had recently appeared in high society, and Hollywood clearly still wanted her. But returning to acting was no longer a simple personal decision. As Princess of Monaco, her public role was now tied to the expectations of the principality and the royal family. She could not simply walk back onto a Hollywood set whenever she wanted. The woman who had spent years building her own career suddenly had to live according to a completely different set of rules. And this is one of the most important things to understand about her story. Grace didn't merely leave Hollywood. She left behind an entire version of herself. She went from choosing scripts to attending official events, from movie premieres to diplomatic occasions, from being directed by filmmakers to representing a principality, from playing fictional characters to having every aspect of her real life examined by the public. The transition was enormous, and it was not always easy. Imagine being one of the most famous actresses in the world at 26 years old. You are independent, you have money, you have a career, you have professional relationships, you have a public identity that you created yourself. Then, almost overnight, you are told that your identity is no longer simply yours. Your clothing matters, your behavior matters, your friendships matter, your public appearances matter, your family matters, your marriage matters. Even the way you represent your country matters, and every mistake can become international news. That was the world Grace entered. Rainier, meanwhile, had his own pressures. He was not simply a romantic prince waiting for his princess. He was the sovereign ruler of Monaco. The principality was tiny, but its political and financial future mattered enormously. Rainier had inherited a difficult situation and worked to strengthen Monaco's international position. Grace's arrival helped transform the image of Monaco around the world. Suddenly, Monaco wasn't just a small principality on the Mediterranean, it was the home of Princess Grace. Her celebrity brought attention, tourism, glamour, and international fascination. In that sense, the marriage was not only romantic, it was also enormously beneficial to Monaco. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Did Grace become the princess because she loved Rainier? Yes, very likely. But did the marriage also serve a larger purpose? Absolutely. Royal marriages have almost never been purely private affairs. They affect dynasties, public image, diplomacy, succession, and national identity. Grace's marriage was no exception. The fairy tale was beautiful, but behind it was a complicated institution, and Grace had to learn how to survive inside it. One of the biggest changes came with her loss of privacy. Before Monaco, Grace was famous. After Monaco, she became something different. She was no longer simply a celebrity people wanted to photograph. She was a princess people felt entitled to observe. Every appearance became meaningful. Every outfit could be discussed. Every family photograph could appear in newspapers. Every rumor could become a story. And because she had once been a Hollywood actress, the public constantly compared the two versions of her. They wanted the glamorous Grace Kelly, but Monaco wanted Princess Grace. Those two identities overlapped, but they were not identical. Grace had to create a new public personality. She became known for elegance, charity work, cultural projects, and her role as Monaco's most recognizable ambassador. She devoted considerable energy to charitable and cultural causes. She helped establish the Princess Grace Foundation and supported the arts. She also became deeply involved in raising her family. Grace and Rainier eventually had 3 children: Princess Caroline, Prince Albert, and Princess Stephanie. For Grace, motherhood became one of the central parts of her life. But family life inside a royal household was not necessarily simple. Royal children grow up under extraordinary attention. Their parents are not simply parents, they are symbols. And Grace understood the burden of being watched because she had experienced it herself. There is another part of the story that is often overlooked. Grace had spent years learning how to control her public image. Hollywood taught her that. But royal life required even greater control. In Hollywood, you could finish filming a movie and go home. As a princess, there was no cut. The role continued at breakfast, at a charity event, at a state ceremony, at a palace reception, in front of photographers. The character never officially left the stage. And perhaps that was one of the strangest things about her transformation. Grace Kelly had become famous for playing women who seemed poised and composed. Now the world expected her to be poised and composed all the time. There was little room for an ordinary human being to have a bad day. The image had become the person, and yet, behind that image, there were ordinary emotions. There were disagreements. There were frustrations. There were pressures. There were expectations. There were moments when the dream must have felt very different from the dream people saw in magazines. This is where the story becomes more interesting than the fairy tale. Because a fairy tale usually asks one question: did they live happily ever after? Real life asks a much harder question: what did happiness actually cost them? For Grace, one of the costs was her career. She reportedly considered returning to the screen on more than one occasion. One of the most famous possibilities was Alfred Hitchcock's Marnie. Hitchcock wanted her for the role, but the idea of Princess Grace returning to acting created controversy in Monaco. The project ultimately did not happen. This tells us something important. Grace had not stopped being an actress simply because she had married a prince. The desire to perform did not necessarily disappear, but her circumstances had changed, her responsibilities had changed, and the world around her had changed. There was a version of Grace Kelly that Hollywood wanted back. There was another version that Monaco needed, and Grace had to decide how much of the old Grace could survive inside the new one. This is why her marriage cannot honestly be described as either a perfect romance or a miserable prison. Reality was more complicated. There was affection, there was family, there was duty, there was public pressure, there was privilege, there were sacrifices, there was glamour, and there were ordinary human problems behind extraordinary surroundings. Rainier and Grace also had very different personalities. Rainier was deeply conscious of his position and responsibilities. Grace had been shaped by Hollywood and American independence. They came from different cultures and different worlds. Their marriage required adjustment from both sides. But because they were royal, the public rarely got to see the ordinary disagreements that happen in most marriages. Instead, people saw photographs. And photographs are dangerous when they become substitutes for reality. A photograph can show two people smiling. It cannot tell you what they said before the camera arrived. It cannot show what happened after they went home. It cannot tell you what a marriage feels like from the inside. Grace and Rainier spent more than 2 decades together. Their marriage was not a short, lived celebrity romance. They built a family. They represented Monaco together. They developed public and cultural projects. They experienced the pressures of royal life together. And whatever private difficulties existed, the marriage endured. But Grace's story became even more complicated as her children grew older. Princess Caroline was expected to eventually become an important figure in Monaco. Prince Albert, as the male heir, carried the enormous responsibility of succession. Princess Rainier grew up in a world of intense media attention. Grace had to protect her children while knowing that the public was fascinated by them. And that could be incredibly difficult. Imagine raising children when the entire world already knows their names. Imagine trying to give them a normal childhood inside a palace. Imagine knowing that a single photograph of a family argument, a teenage mistake, or a private moment could become international news. Grace's role as a mother was therefore also a form of public responsibility. And then came the event that changed everything. On September 13, 1982, Grace was driving with her daughter Rainier on the winding roads above Monaco. The car left the roadway and crashed. Grace suffered severe injuries. She was taken to hospital. She was 52 years old. The next day, Princess Grace died. Her death shocked the world. For people who had watched her transformation from Hollywood actress to European princess, it felt almost impossible. The woman who had seemed to belong to an eternal world of beauty and elegance was suddenly gone. The fairy tale had ended in tragedy. But even here, there is an important detail that deserves attention. Grace's death was not simply a tragic ending to a glamorous life. It changed the royal family permanently. It changed Rainier. It changed her children. It changed the public image of Monaco. And it created a mythology around Grace that has lasted for decades. After her death, the image of Princess Grace became almost untouchable. She was remembered as beautiful, elegant, graceful, devoted, a princess who had given up Hollywood for love. But there is a danger in remembering someone only through an idealized image. Because when we turn a real person into a fairy tale character, we erase the difficult parts of their humanity. Grace Kelly was not a princess born into perfection. She was an actress who became a princess. She was a daughter, a wife, a mother, a professional who gave up her career, a public figure who lost much of her privacy, a woman who had to learn how to live under rules she had not grown up with. And she was also someone who lived during a period when women were often expected to make enormous personal sacrifices for marriage and family. Today, we may look at Grace's decision and ask questions that people in the 1950s asked differently. Would she make the same choice today? Would she continue acting? Would she have negotiated different boundaries? Would she have created a different balance between career and family? We cannot know, and it would be unfair to judge her life entirely through modern expectations. But we can recognize the complexity. Grace Kelly's story was extraordinary precisely because it contained contradictions. She achieved one of the most glamorous transformations imaginable. But transformation has a price. She became more powerful symbolically while becoming less independent professionally. She became more famous while losing privacy. She entered a palace while leaving behind a career. She became a princess while remaining a human being. And perhaps that is the part of her story that deserves to be remembered most. The world wanted to believe that Grace Kelly had everything: beauty, money, fame, a prince, a palace, children, luxury. But having everything on the outside does not guarantee that life feels perfect on the inside. That lesson is bigger than Grace Kelly. We live in a world where people constantly display the beautiful parts of their lives. A wedding photograph, a perfect family portrait, a successful career, a glamorous house. But a photograph cannot tell you the full story. Grace Kelly's life is a reminder that appearances are powerful, but appearances are incomplete. Her wedding looked like the final scene of a fairy tale. In reality, it was the beginning of a completely new life. And perhaps the most fascinating question isn't whether Grace Kelly lived happily ever after. Perhaps the better question is this: what did Grace Kelly have to become in order to become Princess Grace? Because that transformation was enormous. She had to leave behind Hollywood. She had to learn the traditions of Monaco. She had to represent a country. She had to become a mother under the world's microscope. She had to live with constant public attention. She had to turn her natural elegance into a form of diplomacy. And she had to carry a title that millions of people admired, but very few people could truly understand. That is why the story deserves to be told beyond the wedding dress, beyond the palace, beyond the photographs, beyond the word princess. Grace Kelly's life was not simply a fairy tale. It was a human story wrapped inside a fairy tale, and human stories are always more complicated. When Grace first met Rainier, she was one of Hollywood's brightest stars. When she died, she was remembered as Princess Grace. Between those two identities was a life filled with extraordinary opportunities and extraordinary sacrifices. Perhaps she found happiness in that life. Perhaps there were moments when she missed the world she had left behind. Perhaps both things were true at the same time, and that is something we should allow her story to contain, because real happiness is rarely perfect. Real love is rarely simple, and real lives cannot be reduced to one beautiful photograph. Grace Kelly's legacy survives because she represented something larger than herself. To some people, she remains the ultimate Hollywood star. To others, she is the elegant Princess of Monaco. To others, she is a symbol of a different era, when glamour, royalty, and celebrity seemed to exist in a completely different universe. But behind every one of those images was a woman making choices. Choices about love, choices about family, choices about duty, choices about identity. And perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether Grace Kelly's royal marriage was a fairy tale. It is whether any real marriage ever can be. Because the truth is, fairy tales end at the wedding. Real life begins afterward. And Grace Kelly's real life began the moment she walked away from Hollywood and into the palace. So the next time you see that famous image of Grace Kelly in her wedding dress, remember that you are not looking at the end of her story. You are looking at the beginning of the most complicated chapter of her life. A chapter filled with love, duty, sacrifice, family, fame, pressure, and ultimately tragedy. And perhaps that makes her story even more powerful, because Grace Kelly did not live a perfect fairy tale. She lived something far more interesting. She lived a real life that happened to look like one. If this story made you see Grace Kelly differently, don't let the conversation end here. Share this video with someone who has always believed her life was the perfect royal fairy tale. And if you enjoy stories that go beyond the photographs, beyond the headlines, and behind the carefully polished image of history, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. There are many more famous lives with hidden chapters waiting to be uncovered. Until the next story, remember, history doesn't always hide the truth, it sometimes hides it behind the most beautiful pictures.